The wind tore at the thin walls of the cabin, a hungry wolf scratching at a bone. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the quiet desperation that clung to every surface like dust. Eleanor watched the meager fire lick at a log, its warmth barely reaching her legs stretched out on the rough floor. They were useless, twisted things since the fever took her as a child. She lived in the circle of heat, the small world her father could provide against the vast, unforgiving land outside their door. Thomas was outside, checking the traps, a solitary figure swallowed by the immensity of the winter-bitten plains. Each time he left, a cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach, tighter than the ache in her limbs. What if he didn't come back? What then, for a crippled woman alone in this empty place? Survival here was a brutal arithmetic. 2 hands were barely enough, one body working against the elements. Hers was broken before it began. Her world was bounded by these few walls, the sound of the wind, and the low rumble of her father's voice when he returned, often with little to show for his effort. The furs were sparse this season, the game elusive. Hunger was a constant shadow, dancing at the edges of her vision. They ate what they caught, supplemented by the scant, hard biscuits Thomas traded for in the distant, infrequent trips to the outpost, a journey that felt like traveling to another planet. The men there looked at her father with suspicion, a solitary man with a daughter no man would ever want, living too close to the territories. They saw only oddity, maybe something worse. They did not see the quiet strength that built this cabin with calloused hands, the love that kept him tied to this isolated existence, protecting her as best he could. Eleanor saw it, felt the weight of it in every shared silence, every careful movement he made not to jostle her, every piece of dried meat he offered her before taking his own. Yet the fear remained. It was a fear rooted not just in hunger or cold, but in the profound, terrifying loneliness that was her birthright in this wilderness. She was a burden, a weakness in the harsh equation of survival. The fire spat, sending a spark onto the hearth. She watched it die, a brief flare against the encroaching darkness, mirroring the flicker of hope she fought to keep alive within herself. Outside, the wind howled again, carrying the scent of ice and something wild, something untamed and dangerous. Thomas would be out there, facing it alone. The wait was a form of torture, the minutes stretching into hours, each gust of wind a potential messenger of disaster. Her hands, though capable of intricate needlework if she had thread and fabric, were useless for the tasks that mattered here, chopping wood, hauling water, setting traps. She was confined, dependent. The shame of it was a bitter taste, a constant counterpoint to the love she felt for the man who sacrificed everything for her. He deserved more than this life of quiet struggle, tied to her brokenness. Sometimes, in the deepest night, she wished she hadn't survived the fever. It was a dark thought, born of despair, but the wilderness bred such thoughts, stark and uncompromising, like the land itself. The cabin creaked, a sound like a sigh. Still no sign of him, only the wind and the silence within. The latch scraped, a sound that jolted Eleanor from her weary vigil. Thomas entered, bringing with him a blast of freezing air and the sharp scent of pine and something else, blood. He moved stiffly, his face etched with exhaustion, but his eyes held a strange intensity. Behind him, slumped against the doorframe, was a figure, a man. Not one of the few white trappers or traders who sometimes passed, their faces rough and sun-weathered. This man was dark-skinned, his face lean and sharp beneath tangled black hair. Comanche. Eleanor's breath caught. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of her legs. A Comanche in their cabin? Here? Her father had brought him in. Why? The man was injured. She saw now. His leg twisted awkwardly, dark blood staining the buckskin of his trousers. Thomas eased him down onto the floor, his movements careful but strained. "Bear trap," Thomas said, his voice low and rough. Caught him out by the creek. He knelt, examining the leg, his fingers probing gently. The Comanche made no sound, his face a mask of pain, his eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on Thomas, then sweeping around the small cabin, resting briefly on Eleanor. She shrank back, pulling the thin blanket tighter around herself. This was danger, plain and simple. Her father had brought danger into their home. "We can't leave him," Thomas said, as if explaining the inexplicable. "It's broken. And the cold." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Leaving anyone with a broken leg in this weather was a death sentence. But bringing him here, a warrior? Even injured, he felt like a wolf brought into the sheepfold. Thomas began to work, cleaning the wound with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, setting the bone with a grim precision that spoke of necessity learned hard. The Comanche watched him, his jaw clenched, only a faint tremor in his body betraying his agony. Eleanor watched too, unable to tear her eyes away. She had heard stories, terrible stories, of what men like this did. But this man, he lay still, enduring the pain with a stoicism that was almost frightening. His eyes met hers again, briefly. There was no malice in them, only a deep, weary pain, and something else, a flicker of curiosity? No, surely not. Fear was the only sensible response. As Thomas worked, Eleanor slowly edged forward, propelled by a reluctant sense of obligation that warred with her fear. They had little, but what they had, Thomas shared. She heated water on the fire, brought it to him in their only metal cup. Thomas nodded his thanks, using the water to clean the wound further. The Comanche watched her approach, his gaze steady. She kept her distance, setting the cup down gingerly within his reach. He nodded then, a small, almost imperceptible dip of his head. It was the first acknowledgement he had given her, and it startled her. Felt human, not the monster of the stories. Thomas finished splinting the leg, using pieces of wood and strips of rawhide. He helped the man lean back against the wall, closer to the fire. The Comanche closed his eyes, his breathing shallow but more even now. Thomas looked at Eleanor, his face soft with fatigue. "He stays till he can travel," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a decree born of his own unyielding code. Eleanor nodded, her fear still a tight knot, but a new emotion was stirring alongside it, a reluctant, fearful curiosity about the silent, injured man sharing their small, fragile world. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm dictated by the needs of the injured man. He rarely spoke, only in low, guttural sounds that Thomas seemed to understand fragments of or through gestures. They learned his name was Tala. He ate sparingly of their meager food, accepted the water she offered him. Eleanor's initial fear slowly began to recede, replaced by the simple, pragmatic reality of sharing their space. She watched him, watched how he meticulously cleaned his makeshift splint with a piece of bark, how his eyes tracked the movements of the sun across the floor, how he listened to the sounds of the wind and the forest outside with an intensity she had never seen. He was a creature of the wild, even injured. His presence changed the dynamic in the cabin. It was no longer just father and daughter against the world. There was a third element, silent but significant. Tala observed Eleanor too. He saw her difficulty moving, the way she had to drag herself across the floor or rely on clumsy sticks Thomas had carved for her. He saw the quiet determination in her face as she worked on the small tasks she could manage, mending clothes, preparing their simple meals from the small table she could reach. One afternoon, while Thomas was out, Tala watched her struggle to reach a pot hanging from a hook near the fire. Without a word, using his arms and one good leg, he maneuvered himself closer, reached up with a long, strong arm, and gently lowered the pot within her reach. His movements were careful, deliberate, showing no hint of pity, only simple, practical help. Eleanor froze, startled. She mumbled a thank you, her voice rusty from disuse. He merely nodded, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment. In that gaze, she saw not a savage, not a threat, but a quiet understanding. He saw her struggle, acknowledged it, and offered aid without fuss or fanfare. It was a small act, but it chipped away another layer of her fear, another layer of the isolation she had built around herself. She began to feel less like a burden in his presence, and more like another person simply trying to survive. Tala crafted things with his hands even while injured. He sharpened Thomas's dull knife using a smooth stone, his movements precise and practiced. He fashioned a small, intricate bird from a piece of wood he found near the door, his fingers deft and surprisingly gentle. He offered it to Eleanor. She took it, turning the smooth wood in her hands. It was beautiful, simple, and perfect. A gift from a Comanche. Felt impossible, yet here it was. Her fingers traced the lines of the carving. It wasn't pity she saw in him, or even curiosity anymore. It was something akin to respect. Respect for her quiet endurance, perhaps? Or maybe just the simple respect of one survivor for another in a land that offered little quarter. When Thomas returned, he found them in silence, Tala watching the fire, Eleanor holding the wooden bird. He saw the shift in the air between them, a tentative bridge built on shared time and quiet observation. The fear was still there, a low thrumming beneath the surface, but it was no longer the dominant note. Something new was growing in the small cabin, something unexpected and fragile, nurtured by the forced intimacy of their shared hardship. Tala was recovering. Soon he would be strong enough to leave. The thought brought a strange mix of apprehension and a pang of something she couldn't quite name. His presence had been a disruption, a source of fear, but it had also filled a silence she hadn't realized was so vast. Spring arrived tentatively, melting the snow into muddy rivulets that snaked across the land. Tala's leg had healed enough for him to walk, albeit with a slight limp. The unspoken question of his departure hung in the air, heavy with the knowledge that their time together was finite. He spent more time outside now, exploring the immediate surroundings, his keen eyes missing nothing. He showed Thomas better places to set snares, pointed out edible plants Eleanor had never noticed. His knowledge of the land profound and intuitive. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a part of this place in a way they, the settlers, could never be. Their shared existence had created a bond, born of necessity and tempered by mutual respect. Eleanor watched him, the graceful way he moved despite his injury, the quiet strength that radiated from him. She no longer saw a threat, but a man who had been thrust into their lives by chance, and who had offered a quiet companionship that had eased the crushing weight of her isolation. He understood silence in a way few white men did, finding comfort in it rather than emptiness. He saw her, truly saw her, beyond her crippled legs. He saw her mind, her resilience, the quiet spirit that refused to be extinguished. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon painting the sky in fiery hues, Tala sat outside the cabin, sharpening his knife. Thomas was mending a fence nearby. Eleanor sat just inside the doorway watching him. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. He didn't smile often, but his gaze was warm, steady. He spoke then, his voice low, the words slow and carefully chosen, a mix of his language and the few English words he had learned. "You, strong heart," he said, tapping his chest. "Like rock in river," he gestured to the turbulent creek nearby. "Water flows, tries to move rock. Rock stays." He looked at her legs, then back at her eyes. "You rock." Eleanor's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not with pity, but with reverence for her inner strength. It was a profound gift, a recognition of the person she was, not the body she inhabited. Thomas had stopped working, watching them. Tala turned to him then, his expression serious. He gestured between himself and Eleanor, then made a gesture that Eleanor understood instinctively, a joining, a coming together. Thomas walked over, his face unreadable. He looked at Tala, then at Eleanor, then back at Tala. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. What was happening? Tala spoke again, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, using his limited English and expressive gestures. He spoke of the land, of finding his place, of the respect he had for Thomas, and of the strength he saw in Eleanor. He spoke of wanting to stay not just as a guest but as family. He spoke of wanting to walk beside Eleanor, to share the path ahead, whatever its challenges. Thomas listened, his gaze fixed on Tala's face. When Tala finished, the silence returned, heavy and expectant. Thomas looked at his daughter, his eyes searching hers. Eleanor met his gaze, her own eyes wide, tentative, but holding a flicker of hope she dared not name. Thomas finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion Eleanor rarely heard. He looked at Tala. "My daughter," he said, gesturing to Eleanor. "She is my world. The hardest thing I ever did was try to protect her in this world." He looked at Tala again, a long, evaluating look that seemed to see straight into the man's soul. "You see her strength," Thomas said. "Not just the brokenness. You offer her not pity but partnership." He paused, then looked at Eleanor. "He wants to be your husband, Ellie. To join our lives." Eleanor gasped softly. "Husband? Tala?" The fear was gone now, replaced by a dizzying surge of emotion, disbelief, shock, but beneath it, a deep, quiet resonance. It wasn't the life she had ever imagined, but it was a life, a future, one where she was seen, valued, wanted. She looked at Tala. His eyes were steady, filled with a quiet, hopeful anticipation. This man, this outsider, saw her not as a burden, but as a rock. Thomas looked back at Tala, his expression settling into one of profound acceptance. "You saved him?" Thomas said to Eleanor, his voice clearer now, speaking not just of the bear trap, but of something deeper, something only Tala's presence had unlocked. "And maybe he has saved us." The world outside the cabin stretched vast and uncertain, still full of hardship and unknown threats. But for the first time in a long time, Eleanor didn't feel swallowed by its immensity. She felt a connection, a bond forged in fire and shared struggle, a small island of hope in the vast, unforgiving sea of the plains. The quiet strength that had been her hidden core was finally reflected back at her, not just by her father, but by this man, this stranger, who saw her not for her weakness, but for the rock she truly was. And in his steady gaze, she saw the promise of a shared path, walk together, facing whatever the wilderness threw at them, side by side.